Since we're on YouTube, we could start by watching the Gangnam Style video. That's always entertaining.
Always a lot
It has
of fun.
nothing to do with the program, but it's, it's entertaining.
A lot of fun. I'm sure we could find a connection in there somewhere.
Gangnam Style. No, none of these presidents were gangsters, so that doesn't work. I'm not aware any of them could dance, so it might be a bit of a stretch.
All right.
Oh, there's a chat. It's got to be from Diane. Oh no, it's you listing the presidents. There you go. Okay, there we go.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Annie Tillman. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator here at the library. Today we've got Gary Midkiff joining us for the Evolution of the American Presidency, Volume 3. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring those, and then we will come back together and I'll be able to read those aloud to Gary at the end of the program. All right, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Gary.
Okay, very good. Hi, everybody. In 1888, a famous British politician and diplomat named James Bryce wrote an essay that became popular both in the United States and in Great Britain. And the title of the essay was, "Why Are Great Men Not Elected President of the United States?" Now, this was in 1888. So perhaps Mr. Bryce didn't quite have a full sense of history because we had had a few great presidents at that particular point. But I find his comment interesting because of the presidents that we're going to talk about today. You will recall that in each of the first two sessions, I took the rating system that has been applied by C-SPAN and averaged it across the people that we be talking about, remembering that there are 43 men who have been president of the US. And in the first group we talked about, which included some of the founding fathers, the average was 13.1 in terms of the placement on that scale. And then in the second group, we talked about those presidents who wrestled with slavery. The rating dropped to 31.5. And the rating for this group is even lower. It is 32.1. It's actually the lowest of the ratings that we will have, because although we're going to talk about the greatest president the US has ever had, Abraham Lincoln, we're also going to talk about the two worst former presidents we've ever had. Lincoln was preceded by James Buchanan and followed by Andrew Johnson. And the C-SPAN poll rates the two of them at the bottom. So it's interesting. We go from bad to superb and then back to bad. We have two videos to share with you this afternoon. One is an excerpt from the movie Lincoln, where Daniel Day-Lewis stars as Lincoln. And the second is from the Crash Course series. I have shown a Crash Course video in each of the first two sessions talking about the American presidency. And the one I'm going to show today is how presidents govern, which actually has a little more impact for the next three programs than it does so much for today. We're going to start with the excerpt from Lincoln. It is after he has been reelected as president. He has a meeting in the cabinet room, and a couple of them are going to be talking about the imminent attack on Fort Fisher, and that kind of introduces the scene. And then Lincoln is going to be challenged by a cabinet member about the fact that he had passed the Emancipation Proclamation, and now he is pushing really hard to get the 13th Amendment into the Constitution. The words of Lincoln are important because as much as anything, they focus our attention on the issue in the center of his presidency in terms of evolution of the presidency. Lincoln pushed the boundaries of what the presidency could be. And by pushing those boundaries, he enlarged the presidency for all that would follow him. In some cases, that's worked out okay. In some cases, perhaps not so much. But it was Lincoln who pushed those boundaries, and you will hear about that from Daniel Day-Lewis. So as you know, it takes a minute for me to move from here to the movie. So just give me a second and we will get that started.
Thunder Force, God of War. We'll commence our assault on Wilmington from the sea. Why is this burning? Was the boy playing with it? Took by a breeze several nights. This is an official War Department map.
Our cabinet's waiting to hear what it portends.
A bombardment. Thy hoary locks. 58 ships are underway of every
Its target is Fort Fisher. It defends Wilmington Port.
a steady barrage.
100 shells a minute.
Lincoln knew that he had to push the bounds of the Constitution to save the Union. And that can be a slippery argument if it were placed in the hands of someone with less character than Lincoln. We were very lucky that he was there at that time. Let's go back chronologically now and go back ahead of Lincoln to James Buchanan. Buchanan campaigned with a slogan that said, "Elect me, I will not rock the boat." Now, I don't regard that as particularly inspirational, but Buchanan was elected, and then he proceeded to try to not to rock the boat. He said that the source of the problem in the country was agitation from the North. Agitation would be defined as the work of the abolitionists, and it was them that was making everyone upset, which kind of takes the logic of being anti-slavery and stands it on its head, although that's what it was that he tried to do. He fully endorsed the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court that an escaped slave remained property and needed to be returned to his master. And when, during the second half, or actually the last fourth or so of his term in office, some of the Southern militias began attacking and confiscating materials inside of federal depots scattered throughout the South, the President of the United States said, "I cannot intervene because I do not have the power to stop a state from attacking a place where the US government is storing weapons." Again, rather difficult to defend that. But he said he could not act because the Constitution did not allow him to do so. Historians sometimes draw a parallel with him in terms of Nero fiddling while Rome burned, and that analogy I think is pretty good. But let's assume for just a minute that Buchanan had been a forceful and effective leader like some of the presidents we've already talked about. He was destined to fail because the Congress at that point, both the Senate and House of Representatives, was extremely angry at each other. We had fistfights on the floor of the House and in the Senate. We had members bringing in guns, pistols, revolvers, and threatening to use them during debates. Interesting image. And use them during debates. And before Lincoln was even elected, there were some members of both the Senate and the House who resigned their seats and went back to their states in the South because they knew that there was going to be a civil war. So Buchanan was going to fail almost regardless. He just made it worse because of his attitude. We elect Lincoln. As I said, the greatest president that we've ever had. All of the Southern leaning politicians leave. They are mostly Democrats, and they leave. So now the Congress is composed of Republicans, pretty much the part in both houses, the party that represents Lincoln. And the Republicans that are there are what's known as radical Republicans, or sometimes called black Republicans, which is they want to prosecute the war. They are also going to be around for Reconstruction. They're going to want to punish the South after that. They are very aggressive in what they want to do. And to a degree, Lincoln has to jostle with him in terms of who's leading the war effort. Now, think back for a second. This is the most severe challenge to the statement of the Constitution that says the president is the commander in chief of the military. Now, we had the War of 1812. We had the Mexican-American War in 1846 under Polk. We talked about that in our last session. But this is the largest magnitude war that we have had. And as commander-in-chief, Lincoln, unfortunately, keeps picking generals who aren't up to the task. Matter of fact, he doesn't find the right general until he puts Grant in charge in January of 1864. The folks in the legislature become frustrated. They say Lincoln's not being forceful enough. So they set up a standing committee to review the conduct of the war. And they pull powers to themselves, not in the Constitution, to interview leading generals, Union generals, of course, to have them explain why they did what they did, to question their bad decisions, and to put pressure thereby on Lincoln to say, why is this person still a general? Why is that person a general? These days, we pretty much understand that the president's commander in chief and the decisions about the military are either made by or approved by the chief executive. But during Lincoln's time in office, the Congress was fighting to reestablish a much stronger position. Matter of fact, the strongest position that the Congress had had. Remember, a lot of these folks in the legislature had been sitting through in the 1850s, some back in the 1840s, when the debate about slavery was going back and forth. Well, let's compromise here, let's compromise there. None of those things worked. So now we have someone in Lincoln, a lawyer is, of course, and someone who is trying to find the narrow spaces he can navigate in the law or in his own powers, and do so in such a way as to maintain the rule of law that we have. And even Lincoln broke the rule of law. He suspends habeas corpus. He takes one of his greatest verbal detractors, Clement Vallandigham from Ohio, and throws him in jail without the right to counsel because he was regarded, which he was, as a Confederate sympathizer. And Lincoln said, I have to do this if I'm going to defend and protect the Union. And as Lincoln said in that movie clip that you saw, and by the way, if you haven't seen the movie Lincoln yet, oh, for goodness sake, go get it. Get it from Netflix or get it from the library, whatever, but you need to see it. It is historically accurate as well as being a superb movie. But Lincoln is correct. He went up for re-election in 1864 against George McClellan. And McClellan, his former general, campaigned on a basis of elect me and the war will end. Elect me and I will end the war. I will pull back the troops. The South can leave and it's okay. And by a very wide margin, the people of the Union voted Lincoln back in office, which is kind of a confirmation that his plans were ones that resonated with the American people. We were lucky that we had him at that particular time. I've mentioned before in other venues, and some of you have probably heard me say this, the assassination of Lincoln in 1865 is absolutely one of the worst events, if not the worst event in American history. And I say that for a very specific reason. Lincoln was already writing about what Reconstruction would look like. Reconstruction was the period of time after the war when the federal government was involved in trying to be sure that the freed slaves in the South got the freedoms that they were guaranteed by the victory in the Civil War. It's called Reconstruction, carpetbaggers, all that sort of stuff. Lincoln wanted to do it as gently as possible. Get the states back in the Union, get the representatives back in Washington. He said it was the only way to heal the Union. He would probably have been the greatest advocate for the former Confederate states in the federal government. But John Wilkes Booth saw him as the personification of all of the evil, all of the difficulty that the South had lived through in the war. And Wilkes Booth came to convince himself that by killing Lincoln, he would avenge all of the bad things that Lincoln had done. So he kills Lincoln. And as a result, he removes the person who would have been the most effective voice. And when we go through the next couple of presidents, when we go through Johnson and Grant and Rutherford B. Hayes, all of their presidencies are deeply affected, first because they aren't Lincoln, and secondly because of what the Congress, those angry Republicans, are doing to the South. Now, there is no question that the freed slaves in the South needed federal protection because there were a whole lot of folks in the South who said, well, we lost the war, but we don't need to change our lifestyle, so we're going to behave the same way. And that's true. But Lincoln would have been a great advocate for them, and Booth kills him. In terms of setting a standard for how a president behaves during all-out war, we need to put a couple of place markers in place, and we will cover these place markers later. One was how Woodrow Wilson conducted the war, World War I. The second is how World War II was conducted by Franklin Roosevelt. Now, I say conducted, I'm talking about within the powers granted by the Constitution. Both of those men, we will find, went beyond the Constitution, significantly beyond the Constitution, in terms of how they wanted to lead the country in war. And the reference they could make was back to Lincoln, as in, look what Lincoln did here and what he did there, pushing what the Constitution says the president can do. I love Lincoln, but he certainly made people rethink what the limits were to the chief executive in time of war. Those policies aren't as clearly, there is not as much clear connection when we get to George W. Bush and what happened after 9/11. But definitely there are parallels with Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, which we will talk about in subsequent episodes of this program. Lincoln is assassinated and Andrew Johnson becomes president. Johnson had not been vice president during Lincoln's first term. Hannibal Hamlin from New England had been a staunch abolitionist. And Andrew Johnson was given the job to be on the ticket because he had been military governor of Tennessee during the first 4 years of the Civil War and kept Tennessee nominally a state in the Union. So to say thank you for him for doing that, he was made vice president. But he was a Southerner. He had owned slaves. He fully supported the concept of states' rights and secession. He just happened to be the military governor of Tennessee, did what he thought he was supposed to do. And for that, he was rewarded with the vice presidency and then became president. And now, having had the worst president before Lincoln, we now have the second worst president after Lincoln, and that's Andrew Johnson. Why was he so bad? Well, first of all, he's a racist. Secondly, he believed in the legitimacy of what the South had done. Third, he wanted the South to be brought back as quickly as possible, and immediately started butting heads with the Congress, with the national legislature. Congress wanted to be in charge of Reconstruction, and with Lincoln gone, Congress convinced themselves that they would be in charge. They took their summer recess. They went back to their states, and during that time, Johnson tried to take care of Reconstruction by himself. He invited representatives from the southern states to come back. He told them to get their constitutions approved as quickly as possible. And his goal when the Republicans came back to Congress in the fall was to say, well, I've already taken care of Reconstruction. It's all done. Here are the Confederate representatives. We already have their state constitutions approved, and we can just kind of roll along like we were doing before the Civil War took place. The anger that caused in the radical Republicans is hard to describe because they said that's not why we fought the war. We need to punish those states, and you are not helping us. And it set up a level of confrontation, even though Johnson's nominally Republican, it sets up a level of confrontation which is going to dominate the remainder of Johnson's term in office. Remember, Andrew Johnson will become the very first president to be impeached, which is a very serious and seldom used action to be taken by the legislature. Johnson is the very, very first one. Why is he impeached? In simple terms, he is impeached because he kept vetoing a lot of the legislation the radical Republicans were passing. He thought it was too difficult for the South. It was bringing too much problems, too much to bear in the South. The cost was too much, et cetera. He kept vetoing things. Now, the Republicans were able to override most of the vetoes, but they regarded Johnson as an obstructionist. The Republican legislature passed a law on purpose so that Johnson could violate it. It had to do with the removal of a cabinet officer. And sure enough, Johnson removed him, and the legislature said, aha, you broke that law that we passed, and now we're going to impeach you and remove you from office, just to be sure that he couldn't be in the way any longer. Now, Johnson lacked some political skills because he should have been able to negotiate better than that to put himself in that position. And it ends up at his trial that there is a compromise which is reached. Johnson promises not to veto any more legislation. And the asked if he's not going to veto any more legislation, could he finish his term as president? So he's allowed to do that. He vetoes nothing else. He does not run for re-election, and he leaves Washington, D.C. after the remainder of what would have been Lincoln's term. In terms of the evolution of the presidency, what this does to a degree is it underscores the need for a president, if they are going to be effective, to learn to work with their Congress, whether or not the Congress is of the same party. It's still necessary to work with the Congress. Otherwise, there's a whole lot of wasted energy which takes place. Johnson did not do that. Ends up that the country spun its wheels for a long period of time, and Johnson leaves. By the way, for those of you who like historical trivia, here comes one you can make a note, dazzle your friends at dinner tonight. Only two former US presidents came back to Washington, D.C. as members of the national legislature. Those two are John Quincy Adams, who after his presidency was elected as a representative from Massachusetts and served 7 terms. And the other was Andrew Johnson, who went back to Tennessee where he was still popular, and the people of Tennessee voted him into the US Senate. So he came back to Washington, D.C. as the US Senator. Those are the only 2 presidents to have done that. So impact on the presidency, it's an underscore that says you have to try as best you can to work with the legislature if you're going to be effective. He leaves and Grant comes in. Grant pretty much gives control of Reconstruction to the radical Republicans. He doesn't really care. He didn't really have positive feelings about the South. The legislature wanted to punish the South, and he pretty much said, okay, I'm going to let you go ahead. I'm not going to challenge the Congress. You kind of lead what you want to do, and I'm the chief executive, and I will implement it, which is what he did. Grant did accomplish, by the way, something successful in his first term that's worth noting. Among the things that U.S. Congress wanted to fight was the Ku Klux Klan, which was rising and growing virulently. And Grant led the military effort to eliminate the Ku Klux Klan. Now, he didn't eliminate it, but he reduced the effectiveness that the Klan had. It would be a few decades before Klan membership started to rise up and started to affect the South, somewhere just after the turn of the century. So he did a pretty good job of doing that. When the Congress said we want to establish military districts of occupation in the former Confederate state, Grant went along with it. Matter of fact, he helped pick the generals and determine how to do the military divisions so the South could be under control. Reconstruction, therefore, under Grant, now that the president and the Congress are on the same page, mainly Grant says, do what you want to do. Now Reconstruction becomes punitive towards the South. I don't mean to sound that the South didn't deserve some of these punitive behaviors because of what they had done. But the point is, as we talk about the presidency, this is one of those ebbing moments where the president pretty much said, okay, we're going to punish the South and I'll help you execute it, and that's fine. Grant was immensely personally popular. He was elected by a wide margin in 1868. He was reelected by a large margin in 1872. He continued to let the Congress rule what was going on in the South. The Congress by that point was now fully repopulated with representatives of the South. And those representatives still felt that they were being put upon unfairly, but the Republicans still had the majority. And the legislation they did pass, Grant approved. They didn't have to override a veto. So Grant was complicit with what was going on. But the Democrats in Congress, most of them from the South at this point, were upset because they did believe that what was going on was unfair. Grant's second term in office suffers for two reasons. Number one, he appoints a cabinet of people who are not worthy. And the few people he appointed that were worthy in the first term left by the second term. And secondly, he didn't pay attention. And there were a whole lot of people in his cabinet who were much more interested in earning money for themselves than they were in doing the jobs that they had been assigned to do. As a result, scandals started popping up all over the place. The scandals didn't relate specifically to Grant, and we're going to have this take place later on when we get to other US presidents in the 20th century, where there's scandals around them, but they seem to be acting perfectly okay. And Grant did, but he wasn't paying attention like he should have. So weak cabinet, and we know that that is always a sign of an ineffective president, as well as not paying attention, means that the historians, when they review Grant, they rate him much lower than certain aspects of his presidency would seem to indicate that he should have been given. So let's review for just a second. We have a president who has allowed Reconstruction to go forward. We have the representatives from the South continuing to be vocal about it and saying that the North, the radical Republicans, what's left of the abolitionists, are still punishing the South. The Civil War ended 1865. We need to stop it. And the nation approaches another election. This is going to be the election of 1876, which is when Rutherford B. Hayes is going to be elected. Hayes, by the way, is also a Republican, so he follows, if you will, in Grant's footsteps. His election and how he managed to get the presidency has led many historians to give him the nickname of Rutherfraud Hayes, F-R-A-U-D, being substituted in his first name as a fraud. And of all of the elections that have taken place, and we can refer to John Kennedy in 1960, and we can refer to the Hanging Chads in the year 2000, the election of Rutherford B. Hayes was absolutely stolen. And I'll tell you the story about that in a few minutes. We're going to take a timeout now, though, and we're going to go to the second video. This is from Crash Course U.S. History. And let me preview a little bit about this. This is our friend Craig, who talks real fast and knocks the eagle off of his desk multiple times. The topic of this one is how presidents govern. And when you hear Craig talk about how presidents govern, keep in mind that the federal government, relatively speaking, at the time that Hayes becomes president in 1876, is significantly smaller in terms of number of people employed versus the population, smaller in terms of the size of the federal budget compared to what the GDP of the country is. But the next set of presidents are going to start to introduce some of the items that Craig is going to talk about, which are ways that presidents affect their governing that we are now used to because they've been around for a fairly long period of time. So we're going to go through the screen share again. And after this one is done, by the way, I'm going to underscore a couple of points that Craig is going to make that are particularly important for you to pay attention to. And then we will move into the election of Hayes and then what the subsequent presidents do. As I said, this grouping of presidents is not highly rated, and by and large, they are not particularly forceful with Congress. Congress is going to have a whole lot of control over the United States policies through the end of the presidents that we talk about today, and we finished with Grover Cleveland. So give me just a minute. We're going to do a screen share, and I'm going to pull up this video from Crash Course. Give me just a minute.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're going to talk about government. I know what you're thinking. Craig, we've been talking about government for 13 weeks. To that I say, you got me.
But let's talk about actual governing. In particular, the executive branch tools and strategies that the president uses to try to get things done. I mean, the president's just one person, for now. Who knows what sort of animal-human hybrid will be president in the future. But there's a lot of presidenting to be done in the United States. So we usually just talk about the president as if he's the entire executive branch, but obviously there's more to it than that. Technically, the entire federal bureaucracy is part of the executive branch, but it's really big and complicated. For today, let's just look at the top levels, the big wigs, the Hank Greens, the head honchos, the ones that deal most directly with the president. Hank Green doesn't work for the government. At the top of the organizational pyramid is the president, of course, and I suppose just below him is the vice president, ready to break a tie in the Senate, or step in if the president dies, or go to a shopping mall opening on behalf of the president. To paraphrase Truman's desk, the buck stops with the president, meaning he has the ultimate decision in important matters and therefore takes the blame when they go wrong. George W. Bush once called himself the decider, and there's a lot of truth to that description, but many, probably most policy decisions are made at lower levels because there are just too many of them for the president to make them all. The president is served directly by the White House staff, which is made up mostly of trusted policy and political advisors called special assistants. Special assistant, I need more coffee. Other than television versions, we don't see much of the White House staff, except for the press secretary, who's the public spokesperson for the president. Political advisors called special assistants. Special assistant, I need more coffee.
Other than television,
One second.
Staff,
We're gonna make Craig be quiet. Hold on.
Terry, who's the
There we go. Okay, so as you know from various presentations that you may have attended, sometimes technology just kind of thumbs their nose at you. So we're not going to listen to Craig do Crash Course. I don't have an American Eagle to throw around the room here, so I'm just going to have to summarize for you what Craig would have said. In talking about how presidents govern, he talks about the three stages that presidential governing has gone through over time. And the first stage that he talks about is party leadership. This was really important back in the early 1800s. The person who was going to be nominated for president was the leader of the party, and was, whether that was the Whigs or the Republicans or the Democrats, whatever, and was expected to devote a significant amount of their time to leading the party, organizing the party, picking candidates for the party besides governing as president. And that was expected to be pretty much part of what the president did. Over time, the concept of party leadership has become less important. There is a Republican National Committee. There's a Democratic National Committee, and they are responsible for trying to organize fundraising, selection of candidates, trying to make sure there's a coherent platform to the extent that can take place that the party represents. And the president over time has moved away from that. When Lincoln was president, he was unquestionably the leader of the party. By the time we get to Grover Cleveland, who is the last person we talk about today, the concept of party leadership wasn't as important as it was before. Now we've had occasionally a president leap up and clearly indicate they're the leader of the party. Franklin Roosevelt comes to mind. But by and large, party leadership has become less important over time in terms of the way that a president governs. I would challenge anyone to tell me the 5 most important planks in either the Democratic or the Republican platform in the 2016 election. Who knows what they were? We know the candidates were, but not necessarily what the parties represent. Okay, that's the first way presidents govern. The second has to do with mobilizing public opinion. The first president who was superb at organizing public opinion was Abraham Lincoln. And one of Lincoln's strategies I just love, Lincoln found out that if he wrote personal letters to the editors of newspapers, Horace Greeley in New York City in particular, and wrote them as if they were personal letters, that these editors would not be able to hold back and would publish what Lincoln wrote on the front page of their newspapers and then write an editorial in response to what Lincoln had said. Well, the result is that Lincoln was able to get his word out to the American people and communicate with them. Speech making wasn't what it is now. A presidential candidate gives a speech now. It's covered on media within a few seconds, and we can see as much of it or as little of it as we want. So back in those days, it was the written word and written speeches or newspaper coverage. Lincoln was excellent at it. And when we go through the presidents, increasingly, the ability to mobilize public opinion, to get public opinion behind you, becomes really important. At the next chapter of this session, we're going to get to Theodore Roosevelt. And in terms of mobilizing public opinion, Theodore Roosevelt was brilliant at it and moves it forward as a basis for his governing style. We will then later talk about presidents such as John Kennedy, who was able to mobilize public opinion, and in particular, Ronald Reagan, who was excellent at mobilizing public opinion to get support for what he wanted to do. So to a degree, that kind of parallels the change in developments of media, but it was Lincoln who first understood, let me get my words in front of the people, and I can help direct the direction that I want them to go as a result of that. The third strategy, which has become really, really important now, is what's called administrative strategy. And that has two components to it. The first part of administrative strategy is the fact that the president, by virtue of his cabinet and the executive branch, leads and directs those cabinet secretaries in the direction of certain policies. We've seen an example with the current president who does not regard, for example, the EPA in the same way that his predecessor did. Since the EPA has a broad mandate of how it can operate and is an executive branch function, the president can direct it. Congress doesn't necessarily have direct control. They can establish some laws and they have some guidelines, but it's through that the president can have increasing and often significant impact on how the country is governed. Now, the administrative strategy wasn't as important if we're back in the second half of the 19th century, because the government hadn't enlarged itself, although the tendency to do that is something that we're going to see in a few minutes when I get to that portion. The other administrative strategy, and this is interesting, it has to do with what are called executive orders. Executive order is where the president signs something and commits the United States to a particular course of action. But it's only in effect while that president is in office. So the most obvious example that you're familiar with would be the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which we know as the Iran nuclear deal, which was signed by President Obama essentially as an executive order that we would enter into this agreement. It was not a treaty. Remember, treaties require 2/3 of the Senate to approve them. Well, Obama chose not to introduce that to the Republican-controlled Congress. He was pretty certain that they wouldn't approve it. I'm sure he was correct. So it becomes an executive order. Because it's an executive order, the next person in the Oval Office can go, you know what? I'm changing policy and I'm going to take us out of the Iran nuclear deal. Fully legal, fully appropriate under the Constitution, and the executive order has been around since the beginning of our nation. Some presidents never touched it. The president who used executive orders the most, and I'm talking about on an annual basis, not in total, but on an annual basis, was Franklin Roosevelt. To supplement what he did with the New Deal, to supplement his role as the leader of the country during World War II, he issued executive orders left and right. And on an annual basis, he's the leader. Now, because many people don't have senses of history, many people, when I've mentioned it, said, well, I thought that Obama wrote the most executive orders or Trump's written the most executive orders. They're not even close to what Franklin Roosevelt did. But that tool has been around for a long time. Presidents start to use it in the 20th century, not so much in the group that we're talking about now, in terms of the executive order. But it's always been there, just like the ability of presidents to pardon, which has been in the news of late, is something which has been there for the entire time. All right, let's go back to Rutherford B. Hayes. It is 1876. And Hayes and Samuel Tilden have competed for the election. And the popular vote and the vote in the Electoral College are both for Tilden, not for Hayes. But there are some southern states who submit, if you will, two sets of ballot results to the Electoral College. And the Constitution, which is often the case, there's gaps in the Constitution. The founding fathers didn't think of anything, though they defined how the Electoral College counts votes from states, who gets elected president. They didn't actually say, well, what do we do if we have a state that essentially submits two sets of electors based upon two different interpretations of the results? What do we do now? Well, it was undefined. Congress doesn't do well when something like that's undefined. So in January, what Congress decided to do was, and you're going to laugh at this, appoint a committee, because that's what Congress does particularly well. So they appointed a committee, and the committee was assigned an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. The committee was assigned to go down to the three states in the South, all former Confederate states, where we had this problem of what was the actual vote count. And it was their job to audit the votes and determine which vote totals should be used to determine the president. While this process was going on, the leaders of these three southern states went to Hayes and Hayes's people and made them an offer they couldn't refuse. And the offer they couldn't refuse went like this: we will make sure, Mr. Hayes, that you get the majority vote of our state, and therefore the electoral vote of our state, in return for which we want to end Reconstruction. We want to get rid of the military occupation of the South by federal troops. And if you agree to do that, we will make sure that you become president. That was an offer that Hayes couldn't refuse. And so Hayes goes, okay. Suddenly, all of the vote totals change, the electoral votes change, and Hayes is selected as president by the margin of one electoral vote, because all three of those states suddenly, wherever they found them, found different counts than they'd had before, which gave rise to Rutherford Hayes being our president. Having agreed to do that, having agreed to give that up, and which made, by the way, even though he was a Republican, the Republicans in Congress were angry, but now they couldn't do terribly much about it because he had already made that agreement. He stole the election and ended Reconstruction as a result. Having done that, he then said, okay, we need to try to recalibrate the presidency. Under Grant, the American people said there's too much corruption going on. Grant was not absentee, that's too strong, but he was not as involved as he should be in leading the country, and I want to be much more involved in leading the country. Hayes also had campaigned, by the way, on the basis of being a one-term president. And that is relatively rare. There are only a few presidents who campaign and say, I will only serve one term. James K. Polk did it, Rutherford B. Hayes did it, and Teddy Roosevelt did it in the 1904 election. He said, I will only run for one term. And in 1908, he did not run for re-election. He runs later in the Bull Moose Party, but that's the story we will get to later. So Hayes says, all right, I'm going to be a one-term president, and I've given up control of the South, so the Democrats will probably support me in Congress, and I need to reassert what I, Hayes, believe to be the appropriate and traditional role of the U.S. president. And so he tries to do that. He fought the House over certain amounts of authority. And because now the House is more evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, when Hayes vetoed something, it wasn't overridden. So as he tried to accomplish his policy objectives, he was better able with that to say, let's sit down and compromise because I'm going to veto it. And he did veto if he tried to go over my head. Civil service reform was important to him. Now, civil service reform, which is a phrase that we commonly hear, let's go back to understand what that meant, because that's going to affect the presidency of Hayes and Garfield and Chester Arthur, who follows him. Back at the time that Hayes was president, if you wanted to go work for patent office, right? And you were a member of the party of the president who was in power, you probably would have an increased likelihood of being hired for the office. And then you had to be prepared for a deduction from your paycheck that would then go to the party of the president. It was an accepted practice. It was non-negotiable. If you want that job, then you're going to have to take some of your income and give it to that political party. The concept of civil service reform said, wait a minute, there are certain jobs in government where we want to hire competent people, regardless of the party of the president. So if we're going to do that, those people can't be asked to contribute to a party they don't support. So we need a classification. We need a grouping of people in Washington who are immune from that. We understand that they're political appointees. We understand you give $1 million to the president, you can become the ambassador to Switzerland or whatever. We understand that. But for the workers in Washington, D.C., they need to be separated from this process. Hayes begins it, Garfield continues it, and Chester Arthur actually gets it passed into law that there's a group of workers who are professionals working for the government who should not be subjected to that. Hayes also stood up. Now remember, he's president from 1876 to 1880. On the West Coast, there are a whole lot of Chinese workers, and they are there for a couple of reasons. One was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and other reasons were for what we would now call infrastructure projects, particularly in California and to some degree in Arizona. A whole lot of Chinese folks were brought in to provide the semi-skilled, lower-cost labor to do these projects. Well, as sometimes happens, Native Americans, many of them in that area, said, wow, that's unfair. They're taking our jobs from us, and we need to block those darn immigrants from coming into the country. And so we started to, at the state and then at the federal level, try to pass Chinese Exclusion Act, specifically Chinese Exclusion Acts, and Hayes vetoed all of them. And the Supreme Court, by the way, would then also limit the ability of states to do that. And Hayes says that's wrong. Hayes says we need immigrants and we should not block them. They are valuable to us. And as the economy grows, everyone can be employed. Now, that argument is something that you hear now, but Hayes is noteworthy because he is the first president to talk about that. He also does something else. In 1877, there is a strike in West Virginia. And the strike has to do with railroad workers. In those days, railroads ran the country. That's how you moved all your product, et cetera, was railroads. So they were incredibly important. And there was a railroad workers strike, particularly in West Virginia. And the governor of West Virginia said, well, you know what? We just can't have disruption to the railroads. So we're going to call out the militia, and we're going to call out the Pinkertons, and we're just going to beat the heads of those nasty protesters, and we're going to break those unions, and we are going to make sure that the railroads can move because it supports commerce, blah, blah, right? Well, Hayes comes out and says, you know what? I disagree with you, and I side with the workers. This is, by the way, a Republican president. I just want to underscore that. I side with the workers in this case because it's also American to say we disagree, we withhold our labor so that we can talk about and negotiate this point. It's not illegal to do that. They're not involved in subversion of the government, and therefore it's appropriate. And Governor of West Virginia, I disagree with you. Prior to that, American presidents had pretty consistently supported the point of view that workers had certain rights, but they were kind of constrained. And no president had ever done that before. Now, there's not a linear progression from what Hayes did to how other presidents behave. When we get to Grover Cleveland, he's going to make the opposite decision in the Pullman strike in Chicago. So it's not like it's a straight line. But Hayes needs to get credit for saying, wait a minute, I want to get involved in this and I want to support. The Constitution says nothing about whether the president has or does not have the right to support workers, but Hayes does. And later on, when we find Teddy Roosevelt supporting the coal miners' strike, also in West Virginia, he's going to reference Hayes in terms of darn betcha that presidents can come in and get involved in this. Hayes did, and I'm doing it. And now there are some limitations when Harry Truman tries to nationalize the steel industry during his elected term in office. That doesn't go so well, and the Supreme Court says we can't do that. But the important thing is that Hayes is saying, no, the president should be involved in this stuff. And I'm going to be involved because that's how the nation should be governed. So he is reestablishing, if you will, some of the strengths that many people believe, and certainly Hayes believed, were important to the presidency. He finishes his term in office. He said he was only going to serve one term. And James Garfield, also a Republican, is elected president. Garfield will only serve 6 months. He will be shot after 4 months. He will lie near death for close to 2 months and then die. So his impact on the presidency is minimal, with two exceptions. This really isn't so much an impact as this is more anecdotal information about Garfield. Garfield had been a Civil War general. Many of the leading politicians, 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, could point to their service in the Civil War, much like a generation in this country could point to their service in World War II or in the Vietnam War as a basis for supporting them for office. So Garfield had been a general. And during his campaign, he talked about the brave action that he took at the Battle of Chickamauga, riding through enemy forces, Confederate forces, with this critical information to advise the generals on this side of the battlefield what was going on that side of the battlefield. And there were hails of bullets, and he managed to escape them and deliver the information, and everything turned out well. It's an exciting story, and it's also a lie. Didn't happen. But he got elected president based on a lie. Interesting. So anyway, so Garfield gets elected. That never became an issue. He gets elected. When he is elected, for the 4 months that he's actually involved in being president, his focus was civil service reform. That's a continuation of what Hayes started. And his second focus was to reinvigorate federal support for education for blacks. He said that the blacks in the South are not getting equal education, and we know that to have been true. They're not getting equal education, and it's the role of the federal government to step in and improve the quality of education for blacks in the South. Those were pretty progressive positions for him to take. Civil service to some degree, and certainly the federal government lifting up the level of education in the South. He was shot after 4 months. The person who shot him, by the way, was a person who wanted to have a political appointment office in Washington, D.C. And someone on his staff, someone on Garfield's staff, said to the person, no, you're not qualified for the job. The guy got upset and shot him. He lingers for 2 months and he dies. His vice president was Chester Arthur, who's going to serve the remainder of the term for Garfield. It's interesting. Arthur did something which I think is interesting in the context of the times. Garfield is laying in bed and it's not known if he's going to recover or not. He doesn't recover, but it's not known. So Arthur was very concerned about not appearing to wish to act as if he were president prematurely. So essentially, he goes to his home, which is in New York City, and he stays at home. And the decisions that are being made by the government are made by the legislature. There isn't too much that has to be decided on right away. And Arthur goes home and waits. And when Garfield dies, then he comes out of what I would call seclusion, goes to where Garfield's body was lying in state, is sworn in as president, and accompanies Garfield's body back to Washington, D.C. He did not want to appear to be acting as the president. Those of you who have followed the presidency of Ronald Reagan may notice some difference from that behavior versus Alexander Haig, but that's a story for when we get to Reagan and not a story that we're going to get into today. Chester Arthur becomes president. Chester Arthur was a crook who found religion. Let me explain what I just said. In New York, he was a member of the ruling political class in New York, Tammany Hall as it was referred to. And he was a true foot soldier. He was rewarded for all of this work by being made the person in charge of the Port Authority of New York City. Now, the person in charge of the Port Authority of New York City, everyone who had been in that position before Arthur became fabulously wealthy, despite a relatively small salary. Gee, how could they do that? Well, it has to do with tariffs. It has to do with goods coming into the country. And apparently, though we couldn't prove this for sure, apparently the person who was in the position of Arthur was saying, well, you know what, those goods really can't come in the country. But in consideration for a small cash gratuity, maybe we can reconsider and let them in. Or maybe you don't have to pay the full tariff because you're going to pay some of it to me. So Arthur was charged with improprieties. He was never taken to court for them, by the way. He was charged, he was removed from that job, and so much for that. He was put on the ticket with Garfield because he was from New York. He was popular in New York. Garfield's from Ohio, so he was thought to geographically balance the ticket. There's no question he was a crook. So he gets to Washington, D.C. as the president, and suddenly he finds religion. Now he says, you know what? There's a lot going on in the country. The economy is booming. It was the Industrial Revolution. The economy is booming. And there's a whole lot that I need to do. And maybe I should act in a different way than I've acted before. So during his term in office, he acts appropriately. He acts effectively. There are some historians who point to Arthur's first couple of years in office as a particularly effective time for the president of the United States. The fact that someone who was a crook in New York City actually became a better leader when he became president, I find an interesting story for Arthur. He proposed legislation. He went to Congress and said, I understand that you make the laws, but here are some things that I would like you to do. And it was more in the spirit of a working session. We're not talking about the State of the Union message where the president spends 20 seconds ticking off 55 different spending priorities that he would like the Congress to do. We're talking about significant legislation where Arthur goes to Congress and says, here are some things that I think are important for you to consider. Let's talk about them, and then you go work on them because you're the ones who's supposed to pass that and not me, and that's appropriate. He completed the civil service reform that had been started by Hayes, went through Garfield and went to him. He actually defended the rights of Native Americans, which all by itself is going to make him stand out because Any of you who have studied the history of what the United States did to Native Americans understand the application of the word genocide, which is the only appropriate word to use. But actually, Arthur said, you know, we've signed some agreements. We need to honor them. We need to do a better job supporting the people that were here before we were. And that was thought to be relatively unique. When the Supreme Court in 1875, which still had a number of Southern people who've been born in the South who were more sympathetic to the old Southern way of life, actually said that a civil rights law that had been passed a few years before was unconstitutional. It was Arthur who went to Congress and said, you know what, Supreme Court's wrong. So the way we're going to argue with the Supreme Court is we're going to sit down together and we're going to craft some legislation which gets around the objections of the Supreme Court, because this civil rights law these civil rights laws are important. I'll help you craft them, you pass them, I'll sign them, and then we'll let the court take a second look at what we did. And when they did that, as a matter of fact, it worked. And the Supreme Court said, well, we can't deny it now, and those Civil Rights Act. Now, when we say Civil Rights Acts in 1875, 1876, we're not talking about Johnson's legislation in 1964, 1965. But we are talking about a significant step forward for the nation to realize that. Remember, Reconstruction had just ended in 1876 with the election of Hayes. So here comes Arthur going, I understand the South is trying to restrict the rights of former slaves, blacks, but we need to actively support the civil rights legislation that we have passed. And he did so. It's a rather amazing period of time, I think, for what he did. His overall review as a president is average, and I'm talking about the highlights. But what he did in terms of the presidency was, I particularly like his going to the Congress, working with the Congress for legislation. The next time we have a president who's that interested in working with Congress is Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal, where he, during the time after his election, before he's sworn in, he meets with congressional leaders and says, here's some things we've got to do. We want to craft the legislation so we can get it passed as quickly as possible after I'm sworn into office. It's a nice model. But it was Arthur who started to push back on that and say that's good to do. Now, Chester Arthur had an Achilles heel, if you will, and that was a lack of understanding of federal finance. And on that point, I'm going to give Arthur a bit of a pass. The U.S. economy in the last 25 years or so of the 19th century was becoming very complex, much more complex than it had been before. We were still on a gold standard. This is not an economics lecture. Let's just say a gold standard or a metal standard is very limiting. You don't want to be on one of those. So that was taking place. How the federal government would control or not control markets, how the federal government would properly fund itself with the use of long-term treasury notes, et cetera, how the federal government would avoid running out of funds. All of those were relatively new challenges. During the Civil War, the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase for a while, knew that the federal government was spending money a whole lot faster than it had money, which is why we put in a temporary income tax during the Civil War, which ended when the war was over. But that was to support a war which sucked up most of our resources, for goodness sake. The concept of understanding the complexities of the economy was something that kind of went over Arthur's head. And Cleveland is going to be the person who's particularly pummeled by that as a result. So Arthur wasn't prepared for that. The economy is getting more complex. How does the government try to manage the economy? We really hadn't thought through that. And by the way, we were on the gold standard, which didn't work out well either. Arthur leaves. He really didn't want to be president any further. He found the job very tiring. And his wife had died and had thrown him into, if not depression, certainly great sadness for a long period of time. And he didn't really want to be in public life anymore. So he leaves. And now we come to Grover Cleveland, the only person to serve 2 non-consecutive terms in office. So when you hear our current president referred to as number 45, please keep in mind that he's actually number 44, which is he's the 44th person to serve as president. We get to 45 if we count Cleveland as two separate people, which he's not, but he did have two separate administrations with a different person in between. So it depends how you count. And since we're talking about people, we're going to talk about Cleveland, and our current president is the 44th person. But we're going to talk about Cleveland in two different ways because he has two different administrations with two very different sets of problems to contend with. So we're going to talk about him, then we're going to talk about Harrison, then we're going to come back to Cleveland. Same guy, but he had different problems that he had to face. So Grover Cleveland is elected president and takes the presidency in 1886. And it is interesting because Cleveland, more than any other president, said, in essence, he didn't use these words, but it's what he meant. He said, okay, here are my moral beliefs. Here are my ethical beliefs. Here's what I believe is good for the country. And I will be consistent with those beliefs through my 4 years in office. He did that even if his decisions were politically unpopular, even if they caused anger within his party. He said, the people elected me to govern and to be the best president I can be. These are my standards, and this is what I'm going to do. Now, he had that reputation already as being a very moral and upstanding person. He didn't really care if those positions cost him political support because he thought that wasn't the most important thing. But it's interesting, in his first campaign for office, he is campaigning for office, and he is I wouldn't say moral crusader because that sounds like he's trying to change the morals of the country. He wasn't trying to do that. He was saying, here are my beliefs, here's what I believe in, and I'm going to be consistent with those if you elect me. And his opponent, James Blaine, couldn't find anything to run against because the guy is like covered with Teflon. There was nothing that you could complain about. And then the piece of information came out that Cleveland, who was a bachelor at the time, had a child by a woman he did not marry. Now, he would eventually marry someone else. Interesting story. Near the end of his first term, Cleveland, who was 49 at the time, married a woman who was 21, which caused a bit of a scandal. It's only 28 years difference, but it caused a bit of a scandal at the time. They, by the way, had a long and happy marriage, so it worked out for them. But at this point, Cleveland's running for his first term. He's a bachelor. And it turns out that he has a child out of wedlock, as the phrase was used at the time. So the newspapers and his political opponents went crazy. How can he be this moralistic guy? And he had this child. So he holds a press conference. And he says, it's my child. I did it. I was wrong. I am sorry that I did it. I am providing economically for the child. I'm not going to marry the mother, but I will provide for the child till the child is an adult. That will never happen again. And I ask you for your forgiveness. And the American people forgave him. We are not used to politicians standing up and going, I was wrong. It's my fault. I'm sorry. I'll do better. That sequence of phrases is not something we commonly hear from our presidents. Don't need to name names, not important. It's not something we commonly hear from our presidents, but it worked for Cleveland, and his reputation as a moral leader was underscored as a result. As someone who does a little public speaking and a little public writing, I must laugh at the description of one Washington newspaper editor who described the speeches that Cleveland did. Now, Cleveland was very proud of his memory. And in fact, he memorized all of his speeches, including both of his inaugural addresses. But the editor of the newspaper described a Cleveland speech as, and I want to be sure I get this correct, so I'm going to read this one. Quote, a collection of platitudes drawn out to the utmost limits of verbosity, close quote. Someone said that about me, I think I would cry. But in any case, that was the case. So Cleveland goes into his first term in office, 1886 to 1890. And he attacks graft. He attacks extravagances in government. He says they are wrong. They are stealing money from the people. And not only does he attack them, he removes people from government who are found guilty of these particular traits. He goes after tariffs that he thinks are unfair. He said, I understand the reason for the tariff, but it favors one part of the country more than the other. We have to reduce tariffs because they simply are not what are good for the country. The phrase robber barons was popular at the time, and that would be people like J.P. Morgan, et cetera, who had made incredible amounts of wealth through a variety of ways, all of which were legal at the time, by the way, but they were called robber barons. And Cleveland said, that's not appropriate. And although he wouldn't be as aggressive in fighting them as Teddy Roosevelt would be a couple of years later, he started to push back in terms of we need some legislation that's going to balance this off just a bit. Overall, his policies were not particularly controversial. It's going to be much more controversial when we get to his second term. So he leads the nation, but when he comes up for re-election after 4 years and he faces Benjamin Harrison, the American people decide that they want to go with Harrison instead. So he loses office. Prophetically, his wife, who at that point was 23 years old, his wife says to the staff as they're leaving the White House, don't worry, we'll be back in 4 years. And turns out, by the way, she's correct. Benjamin Harrison comes in, follows Cleveland, who pretty much had, pointed to some things, graft, et cetera, and wanted to be a moralistic president, et cetera. And Harrison becomes president. And as president, he takes the presidency backwards a few steps. When I say backwards, I'm talking about he is not a person who pushes the limits. He is much more comfortable pulling back inside the boundaries by the Constitution. Those of you keeping notes on interesting presidential trivia, you can note down that Benjamin Harrison was our second shortest president. We're talking height, second shortest president. He was only 1 inch taller than James Madison, who was, in fact, our shortest president. Interesting from Harrison. Harrison did not have any personal wealth to speak of. So when he ran, and even in those days, you still needed to have a fair amount of money to run, he leveraged a friendship he had with a man named John Wanamaker. Now, you may know the name Wanamaker if you're from the East Coast, because the Wanamakers owned a number of department stores, particularly in Philadelphia. And John Wanamaker had become a friend of Harrison's. And Wanamaker said, well, we're going to need to get some money for you. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to set up a political organization which is going to raise cash for you. It's going to spend it on the election. You don't have to do anything. I'll take care of managing it and spending it in those places that we need to be sure you get votes in certain states. So you just go out there and be presidential, and I'll take care of this. You may recognize the definition of what we would now call a super PAC, except super PACs are now legal. And Wanamaker with Harrison were actually the creators of that concept to gather all of these funds and independently of the candidate, spend them. Harrison also had 2 other issues. First of all, he was an introvert. Not many presidents are introverts. More of them are extroverts than they are introverts. So it's kind of hard to persuade the people, get them all excited for what you're doing if you're going to be an introvert. Pretty much Harrison was. The second thing was Harrison was very, very smart. Now, I not have anything against smart people, but the point is he was smart and told everybody he was smart and proved he was smart and made people feel uncomfortable with how smart he was. That kind of creates a distance between you and the people you're supposed to govern or work with. If you keep reminding them how smart you are, it doesn't work well. And Harrison lost support because of that as well. Now, he did continue to promote the federal spending of dollars to improve education for Blacks in the South. We heard that from Arthur before. He was focused on that, and he did get some money through Congress. the blacks in the South still had an equal education. We need to get to 1954 before the Supreme Court goes, that's unconstitutional. And even then it took decades. One could argue that it's probably not totally balanced yet, but at least he was aware of that and spent some time on that. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed while he was president, which is a critical piece of legislation in the 20th century. Harrison's position on the Sherman Antitrust Act was, well, I guess it's okay. He didn't advocate for it, didn't talk about it. He said, well, if Congress wants to do it, okay. I would think that the president would want to be involved in that legislation or take credit for it or do something with it, but that was not Harrison's style necessarily to do that. He appointed Theodore Roosevelt to the Civil Service Commission. Now remember, civil service at this point was something that was now non-party oriented and was supposed to be to support professionals. Roosevelt, being Roosevelt, submitted all these ideas to Harrison during his first year on that commission, and Harrison didn't respond to any of them, and eventually Roosevelt's going to quit in frustration, as in, my president's not listening to me. Well, he wasn't. Roosevelt gets his own chance later on when he becomes president himself. His cabinet was nondescript, and it was people that he owed favors to. And as we know from studying the presidents, when you pick your cabinet based upon who you owe favors to, it generally does not work out well. So Harrison is, if you will, someone who, to use the phrase from Buchanan, doesn't rock the boat, distances himself with his intellectually superior attitude. By the way, we've had some really, really smart presidents, and many of them have been great politicians. Bill Clinton, incredibly smart, certainly a good politician. So we've had some that do that. Clinton was also a bit extroverted. So we've had presidents that do that, but Harrison, not so much. And at the end of the 4 years, Harrison is more than happy when he is defeated to go, I'm done. And here comes Grover Cleveland again for president. Cleveland's second term in office is a lot more meaningful. And the key story for his second term in office has to do with that robber baron, J.P. Morgan. Remember, we're on the gold standard. Fort Knox actually made a difference. The federal government had to keep metal to back up the currency that was in circulation. There wasn't enough currency in circulation because the economy was growing so fast and needed more currency. It wasn't there because of the gold standard. And the federal government almost went bankrupt. It wouldn't have been Cleveland's fault. Cleveland would have been blamed for it because you always blame the president if something's going wrong, right? So Cleveland would have been blamed for it. But in fact, it was the fact that we had the metal standard. We didn't look at the amount of money in circulation the way we should have. But suddenly the Secretary of Treasury comes to Cleveland and goes, we're about to go bankrupt. The US government's about to go bankrupt. Now, could they print currency? They could, but you're not supposed to print it if you don't have the gold to back it up. So you couldn't quite do that. So what does Cleveland do? He swallows his pride and he contacts J.P. Morgan. Morgan comes down to Washington and Cleveland explains the problem. Morgan says, give me a little time, contact some of his banker friends in New York, comes back to Cleveland and says, okay, here's the offer. We will provide you the money that you need to support the federal government so you don't go bankrupt. The dollar numbers don't translate well because, we've had inflation, but let's just say a huge amount of money. And we will loan this to you. Now we're going to charge you some interest because we're bankers. We're going to charge you some interest, but we will keep the U.S. government afloat. And it is J.P. Morgan who saves the federal government from bankruptcy. But Morgan, who was also a smart guy, says to Cleveland, however, you need to start working with the legislature now because you need to put some controls into effect so this never happens again. You need to look at the cash flow in the economy differently than you've been doing it. Because if you keep doing it the same way, this problem is going to happen again. Cleveland makes a partial response to Morgan. Some controls are put into effect, but not enough. We don't get the controls that we need, the Glass-Steagall Act, et cetera, until we get to the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. But at least Cleveland starts understands the problem. He does understand finance, understands the problem, and starts moving the government to say, we have to do a better job of keeping our own house in order so we don't go through that again. So JP Morgan saves the country and makes a profit. Next time you play the game of Monopoly and you look at Mr. Moneybags on the orange card, that by the way is JP Morgan. That's who it's supposed to be, just so you know. But Cleveland also makes a different sort of decision later on in his term in office. The Pullman strike takes place in Chicago. And this isn't a lecture about the Pullman strike, and besides, I've only got 3 minutes left, so I can't really go into that too much. So the Pullman strike in Chicago, terrible event. People were killed. The militia was brought in to try to break the strike. The mayor of Chicago says we need federal troops to come in. And Cleveland looks at the situation, isn't sure what to do, and asks his attorney general for an opinion. Should the federal government be involved? Well, the attorney general had made his money as a lawyer representing railroads before he became attorney general. So not surprisingly, the attorney general has the opinion that, well, of course, the federal government should be involved. Break that strike because the mail must get through. I'm not sure the mail was all that important, but the mail had to get through, and federal troops came in to break the strike. That set in motion a number of things. Now, Cleveland, remember, was a Democrat, not a Republican, and that started to move labor away from Democratic support. Labor doesn't come back and start supporting Democrats again until Franklin Roosevelt. This became a major political issue in terms of support, because labor unions had, generally speaking, been siding with Democrats over the previous 20, 25 years. But this particular decision by Cleveland made them rethink their point of view. We end there with Grover Cleveland. When we meet again, we are going to move into the 20th century, and we are going to begin with William McKinley, who is a president who had a major impact on the presidency, as well as the direction of our country. So we're going to start with him when we resume at our next scheduled date. I am going to check chat, and it looks to me like we've got one chat message. I'm not sure what it is. It looks like it is a list of the presidents we're talking about from my handout today. So we don't need to stay with that. That's it. So although I cannot see you, I can see your head count there. So thank you very, very much for attending. We will continue with our next. Oh, Mary Ellen has raised her hand, but Mary, I can't hear you. So if you don't, you can send me a chat real quick if you're quick with that.
The next
Or
one.
are you? Go ahead.
Question from Donna. So the next one will be in September. That'll be up on the calendar shortly.
Okay. And we've scheduled for 6 of these this year. And although we're a little off in our timing, we will do 6. So we will get to do all of the former presidents, which means in December, well, we'll see who we talk about when we get to December. We'll see. All right. Thanks everyone for coming, and glad you were here. And I'll see you again for the next session. Oh, there is? Go ahead.
Yes, that was in the Q&A box. Would Lincoln still have been considered a great president if there was no Civil War?
No. One of the things that Harry Truman taught us is that presidents do not get to choose the conditions they are confronted with. And my favorite counterexample is Calvin Coolidge, who, after he left office, was asked by a newspaper reporter, what are you most proud of your administration? And Coolidge says, I'm proud that I did nothing. That's a quote, by the way. I'm proud that I did nothing. He wasn't asked to do anything. There wasn't anything of great international consequence that Calvin Coolidge had to do. But our great presidents, Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Abraham Lincoln, all confronted major issues and were up to the occasion. We can contrast them then with some presidents who were confronted with major issues and did not rise to the occasion. An example being Jimmy Carter. Now, as I've said in other venues, I admire Jimmy Carter more than any other living American, hands down. The guy is amazing what he has done with his life. But his presidency, oh my goodness, was awful in total. It was awful. Great person, bad presidency. So he didn't rise to the occasion. But the four that I mentioned just a moment ago did. So no, Lincoln would not have been viewed as a great president because there wouldn't have been great issues. But remember, slavery was there, so it was going to explode and it did. Go ahead, Annie.
I am dropping a link to the crash course in the chat box if anybody wanted to watch that. And then the other question that we had that popped up is what caused Cleveland to lose to Harrison?
There wasn't a particular reason. There wasn't any great issue. In fact, it was one of those where Cleveland won more of the popular election, if I remember correctly. So there wasn't a particular issue other than the country wanted to go back Republican versus Democrat. There wasn't a particular key or critical issue that caused that to take place. And then after 4 years, the country said, wait a minute, Cleveland wasn't so bad. And he got 4 more years. So it wasn't like there was a key issue for him.
All right. I think that might be it. If anybody has any last questions, please put them in those chat boxes now. Otherwise, have a great rest of your afternoon.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Take care, everyone. Bye.